Hello, Year 9. It's all a bit weird, isn't it? What I'm doing is I'm going to record the answers to the lesson, which was Sherlock Holmes. Oh, can you see that? Sherlock Holmes lesson 3, because there's a lot of tasks there with not many answers. But before you watch this video, have a go at it first, okay? Because you should watch this video after you have a go and then check your answers. Um, just a quick hello from my dog Pip. Say hello to Year 9 Pip. Pip's really enjoying isolation because she goes for a walk every day and we're at home all the time. So she loves it. Don't you, Pip? Can I say anything? No? Can I say anything? Good. Okay, so Sherlock Holmes lesson 3. So the 5 a day were: when was The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes written? It was 1892, so this is in the Victorian era. Question 2, what is social injustice? Social injustice just means unfairness in society. There was quite a lot of social injustice now, but there was certainly more social injustice in the Victorian times. What was life like in the Victorian England? It was good if you were rich, not so good if you were poor, but it was a time of great wealth, a time of great growth, lots of technological changes. But because we're studying Sherlock Holmes, there was no real professional police force yet, or certainly no sort of forensics. So Sherlock Holmes was like the first forensic detective. Um, what 3 items did Sherlock Holmes never leave the house without? I think you had to do your individual research for this. I googled it and it came up with a pencil, a small notebook, and a magnifying glass, which is probably quite a good thing to have. Okay, how are the workhouses described in the Oliver Twist extract from lesson 2? They were very poor. They didn't get to eat much. I don't think it went into what sort of work they did, but yeah, the workhouses were, instead of benefits, they went to workhouses, and they got separated from their families and exploited for labour, basically. Okay, so task 1, we had to read a passage from the Sherlock Holmes mystery, A Speckled Band, in which a distressed woman has just arrived to the house of Holmes to beg for his help in solving a mystery. So first of all, there's some glossary tasks for you. Pitiable, that was given to you, arousing pity. Agitation. So agitation, you might have come across this in science. If you agitate a solution, but it's a state of unrest, basically, a state of unrest. Weary means tired. Haggard, much like me, old and unkempt. Okay. But task 2, list 3 things that Holmes works out about the woman. So there's some obvious things he works out and some less obvious things he works out. So I put, from one of the most obvious things that he worked out was she's a woman of 30 but prematurely old. So give yourself a point if you've got that. Another thing that he worked out about her is that she came in on a train, and in particular an early train. It doesn't tell us what time this meeting happened, but we can assume that Holmes would know, because his office is in Baker Street in London, that if he would know that she's from out of town, maybe by the way she dressed. But the fact that she's there meeting him, he knows that she's coming on an early train. And of course, he knows this because she's holding the other half of a return ticket in her left glove. The other thing he knows about her, and this is where forensics comes into it, she had to take a dog cart to the station, and it was a fair journey. A dog cart, I don't know exactly what that is, but I should imagine it's like a low cart pulled by a horse. A dog cart doesn't sound very rich, does it? But if you Google it, I'm sure if you have a look at it, it would be like a low sort of passenger cart. And the fact I mentioned that Sherlock Holmes was one of the first forensic detectives. When we first meet him in A Study of Scarlet, which is, you haven't got that story, but Watson, we meet him through Dr. Watson, and he's actually a bit of a strange character, Sherlock Holmes. He spends a lot of time in the Victorian morgues doing things like beating up corpses to see how the bruises or the blood splatters happen. So the fact that he can tell by the mud splatters that it's a particular type of car might sound far-fetched, but you've got to think of Sherlock Holmes as a sort of almost OCD, almost slightly on the autistic scale. He's sort of that brilliant with observation. Okay, task 3. Highlight or underline words that show the woman is distressed. Then pick 2 and explain the effect on the reader. Okay, so the first one that I put was the reader assumes with Holmes that the woman is cold as she is. I'm going to do quote marks to show you. I say this to you all the time, but when you've got to embed quotes, the smaller the word that you pick out, the easier it is to make your sentence work. Okay, so the reader assumes with Holmes that the woman is cold as she is shivering and is invited to sit by the fire to warm up. The woman clearly shows she is distressed by her opening remark, "It is not cold which makes me shiver," which makes the reader determine that she is shivering because she is scared. The fact that she says this in a low voice also shows the reader that she is subdued and possibly intimidated. Okay, so sometimes I've picked out only a bit of that quote to make it work in my sentence. Okay, the next one, question 2. Holmes's description of the woman's pitiable state of agitation clearly shows the reader that she is distressed. Her worry has clearly had an effect on her health, as her face is all drawn and grey. She is in a paranoid state, as her eyes are described as restless and frightened. Finally, the use of a simile to describe her eyes like those of some hunted animal suggests to the reader that she is under considerable threat. So note, I'm getting some subject terminology in there, and I'm explaining the quotes. I'm not just putting the quotes down. Okay. Task 4. This is the evaluate question. So a student having read the text said the writer succeeds in showing the reader that Holmes is a great detective. To what extent do you agree? How does the writer show you this? I'm not going to read you all the way through this because otherwise the video would be too long. But when you have something like this where you've got to agree or disagree with a student, it's always good to sort of you can sort of agree with them, but always try and find something to sort of question their statement as well, because it shows that you're thinking and you're weighing up both sides of it. So you've got to start by saying if you agree with it. So you could say, overall, I agree with what the student is stating, that Holmes is a great detective. The only thing I would disagree, and then it gives you some tip, go from the beginning, the middle, and the end. The only thing I would disagree is the fact that she turns up and Holmes's first response is that she's cold, not that she's terrified. So surely most of us would know if someone came into the room and they were terrified, you would know that they were terrified, wouldn't you? It's just like a human thing. You wouldn't necessarily think she was cold. So I disagreed that he didn't detect that she's cold and not terrified. And that made me say something about the fact that Sherlock Holmes is very logical. He's not so good at emotions. Okay, but I do agree. The first point, he recognises she's 30, even though she's prematurely grey. So someone might not have recognised that she was that young because she had grey hair. Then it gets more obvious. He figures out she comes in by train because he spots a return ticket in the left glove, which must have been very small. So this shows that he's very observant, which is a good skill to be a detective. And also, we're not told what time of day it is, but his office in Baker Street, the fact that she's turned up there, he knows that it was an early train and not a late train. He probably knows the timetable off by heart. But the main part that he's a great detective is by the mud splatters. The mud splatters shows Sherlock Holmes is in a class of his own as a detective. He's sort of using early CSI, if you like, but don't call it that, early forensic techniques. He recognises this mud pattern from a particular type of cart because it's splattered. And he also notices that she didn't drive it herself because it's on her left arm. So the driver sits on the right side because, you know, in this country we drive on the left side of the road. So he knows that she was driven. He knows what type of car it was, and he knows it was a fair journey because there's 7 splatters. So that's immense in terms of detection, isn't it? And then the only last point that I'd agree with is the fact that he's got a reputation. She's heard of him. Okay, Year 9, hope that was helpful. I hope you didn't cheat, but check your answers against this. If we have lessons like this that need answers, I'll try and do a video again. Okay, bye.